The Ravens Weird, a Viking Saga. Above the black waters of Gjallarfjörður, the ravens wheeled backward against the wind, their harsh cries piercing the grey dawn, like the screams of the dishonored dead. Astrid Runeweaver watched them from the sacred grove, where the bodies of 9 thralls hung from Yggdrasil's children, their blood long since fed to the roots that drank deep for the All-Father. The vulva's ancient fingers traced the carved staves in her hands, each rune burning cold against her flesh as the vision took her deeper into the web of fate the Norns had woven. "Skuld shows me backward-flying ravens," she whispered to the wind that carried her words to the ears that mattered. "The youngest Norn weaves strange threads this morning. I see a bloodline split like lightning through oak, brothers turned to enemies, and a ship with a dragon's head sailing into the setting sun toward lands where no Volva's sight has wandered." Her voice grew stronger as the Seda magic coursed through her bones like molten iron. "The Blood Axe clan will know glory and doom in equal measure, and their word will stretch across the whale road to touch shores yet undreamed." Jarl Bjorn Bloodaxe stood at the edge of the sacred grove, his massive frame casting shadows across the frost-hard ground. His byrnie of iron rings caught what little light filtered through the morning mist, and the great axe Bonignar hung at his side like a sleeping wolf awaiting the hunt. Behind him, his Huskala shifted restlessly, their breath steaming in the cold air as they waited for their lord's word. The Jarl's weathered face showed no emotion as he listened to the Volva's prophecy, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped his silver arm ring, the sacred oath band that bound him to his followers, and they to him. "Speak plainly, wise woman," Bjorn growled, his voice carrying the authority of one who had led men through the storm-tossed whale road to victory in 17 summers of raiding. "What do the Norns show you of my blood and my hall?" Astrid's milk-white eyes fixed upon him with the terrible sight that pierced the veil between worlds. "Your sons will be wolves and eagles both, Bjorn Bloodaxe. One will feast in Valhalla's golden hall before the snows of his 20th winter melt, and the ravens will sing his name. The other will sail beyond the edge of the world and plant his spear in soil that has never known the tread of mortal men. But between them lies a chasm deeper than hell's hungry maw, and blood will flow like spring torrents before your line finds peace." The Jarl's eldest son, Eirik, stepped forward from among the Huskala, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. At 19 winters, he already stood as tall as his father and bore scars from 3 successful raids on the Saxon coast. His younger brother Olaf remained silent in the ranks, his 16 winters marking him as old enough for battle, but not yet proven in the eyes of the warband. The brothers had shared the same hearth and trained with the same weapons master, yet any man with eyes could see the tension that crackled between them like lightning before the storm. "Let the Norns weave what they will," Eirik declared, his young voice carrying across the grove. "I seek only to die well with sword in hand, and Thor's hammer blessing on my blade. If Odin's daughters choose me for their hall, then I will earn my place at the All-Father's table with deeds worth singing." He drew his blade and let it catch the morning light, the pattern-welded steel showing the serpentine lines that gave it the name Adda's Kiss. "I swear by this iron and by the ring on my father's arm that I will bring honor to the Bloodaxe name or die in the attempt." Young Olaf's jaw tightened at his brother's boast, but he held his peace as befitted a younger son. His own sword, inherited from their grandfather, bore the name Weird Striker, and though he lacked his brother's size and strength, none could match his skill with the blade when the mood was upon him. The weapons master often said that Olaf fought like water finding its way through stone, while Eirik was the avalanche that crushed all in its path. The Volva's laughter rang harsh as the ravens' cries above them. "Boast when you have earned the right, young wolf. The threads I see are dark with betrayal and bright with foreign gold. Before 7 winters pass, the Blood-Axe Hall will echo with the screams of kinslaying, and the Whale Road will run red with the blood of sworn brothers. She raised her staff, crowned with iron and bone, its runes flaring with eldritch light in the growing dawn. Hear me, sons of Bjorn, and remember these words when the choice comes upon you. The man who breaks faith with his Felag will know neither rest in Midgard nor welcome in the halls of the gods. A cold wind rose from the fjord below, carrying the salt scent of the sea and the promise of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The 9 corpses swayed in their nooses, their lifeless eyes reflecting the pale light as the ravens settled upon their shoulders to feed. Jarl Bjorn turned away from the grove, his face grim as stone, and his men followed him down the winding path toward the great hall that dominated the headland like a ship's hull turned to wood and thatch. Blood-Axe Hall rose from the rocky ground like a monument to the old ways, its massive timbers carved with serpents and ravens that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of the eternal hearthfire. The hall stretched 100 paces from end to end, its high roof supported by pillars that had once been the masts of Bjorn's first longship. Along the walls hung the shields and weapons of 3 generations of warriors, their iron gleaming dully in the smoke-hazed air. The high seat at the hall's far end bore the carved likenesses of Thor and Odin, their eyes seeming to watch all who entered with the weight of divine judgment. As the household gathered for the morning meal, the talk turned inevitably to the Völva's words and their meaning. Skald Thorolf, his fingers dancing across the strings of his harp, had already begun to weave the prophecy into verse, his voice carrying clearly above the clatter of bronze cups and the scrape of knives on wood. The Skald's art demanded that he preserve the words exactly as spoken, for the Norn's threads could not be altered by mortal interpretation, yet already he sensed the shape of the saga that would grow from this morning's seeds. Ravens backward flying, fate threads twining, blood will flow ere brothers peace, he sang, his words falling into the rhythm that would carry them through generations of telling. One to Valhalla's golden glory, one to lands beyond the sunset. Between them lies the wolf's dark hunger. Jarl Bjorn raised his horn of mead and looked upon his gathered warriors, men who had followed him through storm and battle for 20 years of raiding seasons. Some bore grey in their beards now, veterans of the great raid on London when they had driven the Saxon king's men into the Tamis and claimed enough silver to build this very hall. Others were young men seeking their first taste of glory, sons of farmers and fishermen who had proven themselves worthy of a place at the high table through strength of arm and steadiness in the shield wall. Let the wise woman speak of doom and kinslaying, the Jarl declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. We are wolves of the sea, sworn to each other by bonds stronger than blood. When the sailing season comes, we will take our ships across the Whale Road as our fathers did, and we will return with gold enough to silence any prophet of ill fortune. The gods help those who help themselves, and the Blood-Axe name has never known shame in battle or betrayal in the feasting hall. But even as his men raised their horns in response to his words, Bjorn felt the cold touch of Weird upon his heart. The Völva's gift had never failed in all the years he had known her, and her words carried the weight of the Norn's weaving. He caught the eyes of his 2 sons where they sat among the warriors, seeing there the seeds of the future conflict that would tear his hall apart like wolves fighting over a fresh kill. Young Thora, his only daughter, sat among the women at the side benches, her fingers busy with the endless work of spinning thread into cloth. At 15 winters, she possessed her mother's beauty and her grandmother's fierce spirit, qualities that had already attracted the attention of neighboring jarls seeking alliance through marriage. Yet none had dared approach Bjorn with formal offers, for Thora's tongue was as sharp as her brother's swords, and she had made it clear that she would choose her own fate or die attempting it. Father speaks of gold and glory, she murmured to her fosterage sister Ingrid, but the Völva's words ring truer than iron on iron. I have watched my brothers these past winters, seen how they circle each other like rival stags before the rutting season. Each thinks himself the worthier heir, and neither will yield to the other when the time comes for choosing. Ingrid, daughter of a neighboring Carl, who had sent her to Bloodaxe Hall to learn the ways of the highborn, nodded thoughtfully as her own fingers worked the distaff and spindle. Perhaps the Völva speaks of distant times, she suggested, her voice carefully neutral. Many prophecies take generations to fulfill, and much can change between the speaking and the doing. Thora's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. You have not lived in this hall as long as I have, sister friend. The seeds of what is to come are already planted and growing. See how Eirik sits at father's right hand and speaks as if he were already Jarl in truth, while Olaf watches from the left and says nothing but thinks all the more deeply for his silence. The Völva saw truly when she spoke of brothers turned to enemies. The winter months that followed brought the long darkness and driving snow that imprisoned all within their halls, forcing enemies and friends alike to endure each other's company through the season of ice and shadows. In Bloodaxe Hall, the tensions that had simmered through the autumn feast days began to show themselves more openly as men gathered around the great fire to drink and boast of past glories while planning the raids to come. Eirik had taken to surrounding himself with the younger warriors, men whose loyalty he had won through gifts of arm rings and weapons taken in battle. He spoke often of the great expedition he would lead when the ice broke, a voyage to the rich monasteries of Hibernia where the Saxon and Irish princes stored their treasures in stone towers that thought themselves safe from northern wolves. His followers hung upon his words like starving men scenting roasted meat, for Eirik possessed the gift of leadership that drew men to him as iron draws to lodestone. Olaf kept his own counsel and spoke little in the great gatherings, but those who watched closely saw how the older warriors sought his opinion when the talk turned to matters of navigation and weather reading. His fosterage at the court of King Hakon in Noreg had taught him much of the seacraft that his brother had never bothered to learn, dismissing such knowledge as work for thralls and Carl-born navigators. Where Eirik dreamed of gold and glory, Olaf studied the stars and currents with the patience of one who understood that the Whale Road gave her treasures only to those who approached her with proper respect. The Yule feast brought temporary peace to the hall as the household honored the return of the light and the promise of spring's eventual coming. Jarl Bjorn ordered the sacrifice of a great boar to Freyr, lord of fertility and abundance, and the blood was sprinkled upon the earth around the hall's foundations to ensure prosperity in the coming year. The skald Thorolf composed new verses celebrating the deeds of the Bloodaxe line, tracing their lineage back to the god-touched heroes of the elder days, when giants walked the earth and the gods took mortal lovers. Yet even in the midst of celebration, the shadow of the Völva's prophecy lay heavy upon the feast. When the lots were cast to determine who would lead the season's first raiding expedition, the marked stick came to Eirik's hand 3 times running, a sign that the gods favored his cause. Olaf accepted this with outward grace, raising his horn to his brother's fortune. But those who knew him well saw the tightness around his eyes that spoke of deeper concerns. The Norns weave as they will, Olaf said when the formal toasts were done and the hall had settled into smaller groups for private conversation. But even the gods cannot change the fact that a ship needs both strong arms and skilled guidance to reach safe harbor. I pledge my sword to your expedition, brother, and my knowledge of the sea roads that lead to Hibernia's shores. Eirik clasped his brother's arm in the gesture of warriors acknowledging mutual respect, but his smile held more triumph than gratitude. Your counsel is always welcome, brother mine. When we return with Irish gold, there will be honor enough for all who sail with us. But privately, to his closest followers, Eric spoke differently. "I will not have my younger brother's hand upon my steering oar," he told them, as they huddled around a side fire after the main celebration had ended. "This expedition will make my reputation as a leader of men, and I need no reminder that others think my knowledge incomplete. Olaf may stay behind to guard the hall and spin thread with the women." Word of this slight reached Olaf through the invisible network of loyalties and obligations that bound every great household together. Thralls carried gossip as they served the tables, and Carl-born warriors chose their allegiances carefully in the game of advancement that played out beneath the surface of every feast. By the time the Yule fires had burned to ash, the division between the brothers had become a chasm that would shape all the choices to come. The first thaw brought news from across the Whale Road that would test the bonds of kinship and loyalty more severely than any Völva's prophecy. A messenger arrived from King Olaf Tryggvason in Noreg, bearing word that the king sought strong warriors to aid him in his campaigns against the southern Jarls, who still honored the old gods instead of the White Christ. The message was directed to Jarl Bjorn himself, but the king's words made it clear that he remembered the younger son who had fostered at his court and wished to see him return with a warband of proven fighters. "This is the chance I have waited for," Olaf told his father in the privacy of the Jarl's sleeping chamber, away from the ears that always listened in the great hall. "King Olaf offers gold and land to those who serve him faithfully, and his cause will prevail whether we join him or not. The White Christ grows stronger with each passing season, and those who stand with the old ways will find themselves swept aside like leaves before the autumn gale." Jarl Bjorn's face darkened at his son's words, for the conversion of kings to the foreign god was a source of deep concern to all who honored Thor and Odin. "You speak of abandoning the faith of your fathers for the promise of a king's favor," he growled. "What of the oaths you swore at your first sacrifice, when you offered your own blood to the All-Father and received his blessing on your blade? Will you count such things as nothing for the sake of advancement?" "I speak of survival, father," Olaf replied, his voice steady despite the anger he saw building in the older man's eyes. "The world is changing whether we acknowledge it or not. The Saxon kingdoms grow stronger under their White Christ, and they no longer flee when our dragon ships appear on their horizons. King Olaf's new faith may be foreign, but it brings unity and purpose to those who embrace it. Would you have the Blood Axe name fade into memory because we could not adapt to changing times?" The argument that followed rang through the hall like the clash of sword on shield, for neither man was willing to yield ground in a matter that touched upon honor and tradition. Eric entered the chamber as the shouting reached its peak, and his presence only added fuel to the flames as father and younger son turned to him for support in their dispute. "What says my heir to this talk of abandoning our ancestors' gods?" Bjorn demanded, his hand moving instinctively to the hammer pendant at his throat. "Will you also counsel me to bow the knee to the White Christ for the sake of political advantage?" Eric's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying the certainty of youth and unexamined faith. "The gods who led us to victory in battle are the gods we should honor at the feast table. Thor's hammer has never failed to bring me safe through the storm, and Odin's ravens have guided my sword to the hearts of my enemies. I see no wisdom in abandoning such allies for the promises of a tortured god who preaches meekness to warriors." The words fell between the brothers like a blade drawn from its sheath, sharp and gleaming with malice. Olaf's face flushed with anger at the implication that he counseled cowardice, and his hand moved to his own weapon's hilt in response to the insult. "You speak of wisdom, brother," Olaf said, his voice dropping to the deadly quiet that experienced warriors recognized as more dangerous than any shout. "Yet wisdom lies in seeing beyond the next raid or the next feast. The kings who accept the White Christ gain allies among the Saxon kingdoms and the Frankish princes, Their ships carry merchants as well as warriors, and their halls grow rich from trade as well as tribute. What wisdom is there in clinging to isolation when the world grows ever more connected? The wisdom of wolves who do not lie down with sheep, Eric shot back, his young pride stung by his brother's reasonable tone. The wisdom of warriors who win their gold with iron rather than prayers. If you wish to prostrate yourself before a foreign god for the chance of royal favor, then go with my blessing. But do not expect the blood axe hall to follow where you lead. The sound of steel-clearing leather filled the chamber as both brothers drew their blades, the pattern-welded metal singing its deadly song in the firelight. For a moment that stretched like the space between lightning and thunder, the three men stood frozen in a tableau that would echo through the halls of memory long after their bones had turned to dust. Then Jarl Bjorn's roar shattered the silence like Thor's hammer striking the earth. Enough! The Jarl's voice carried all the authority of his 20 years of leadership, all the weight of the oath rings that bound his household together. I will not have kinslaying in my hall, nor the sound of fraternal strife to poison the air my fathers breathed. Sheath your blades, and remember that you are sons of the same mother, brothers sworn to the same loyalties. Slowly, reluctantly, the brothers returned their weapons to their scabbards, but the damage had been done. The words spoken in anger could not be called back, and the trust that had bound them since childhood lay shattered like a ship driven onto unseen rocks. Around them, the very timbers of the hall seemed to groan with the weight of destiny fulfilled, as if the Volva's prophecy had taken root in the soil of sibling rivalry and begun to grow toward its inevitable fruition. In the days that followed, the household sorted itself into factions as inevitably as iron filings aligned themselves to the lodestone's pull. The younger warriors, hungry for glory and impatient with the complexities of politics, gravitated toward Eric and his promise of Irish gold, won through honest battle. The older men, those who had seen kingdoms rise and fall like waves upon the shore, found themselves drawn to Olaf's more cautious counsel and his understanding of the changing world beyond their fjord. Thora watched the division of her father's hall with the clear sight of one who stood outside the masculine game of honor and ambition. From her place among the women's benches, she saw how the servants chose their loyalties based on promises of advancement, how the Carl-born warriors weighed their options like merchants calculating profit and loss. The Volva's words echoed in her mind like the voice of Wyrd itself, and she began to understand that her own fate was tied to the choices her brothers would make in the coming season. They will tear this hall apart like wolves fighting over carrion, she confided to her fosterage sister as they worked at their looms in the women's quarters. Father grows old, though he would strike down any man who dared speak such words aloud. When his time comes to join his ancestors in the high seat of memory, there will be no clear succession to unite the household under a single leader. Ingrid's shuttle paused in its passage through the warp threads as she considered her friend's words. Perhaps the Volva spoke of distant times, she suggested, though her voice carried little conviction. Many prophecies take years to fulfill, and much can change between the weaving and the cutting of the thread. Time moves like a river toward the sea, Thora replied, her own hands never pausing in their work despite the weight of her thoughts. What the Norns have woven cannot be unwoven by mortal wishes or hopes. I have seen the signs in the smoke of the sacrifice fires and heard them in the cries of the ravens that gather at dawn. Before the summer sailing season ends, this hall will know blood and betrayal, and the blood axe name will be spoken with either great honor or great shame throughout the northern lands. The spring thaw brought the first trading ships of the season, their holds filled with amber from the Baltic shores and furs from the vast forests of the east, where the Sver and the Russes hunted among wolves and bears. With them came news from the wider world that would set in motion the events the Volva had foreseen. King Olaf Tryggvason had won a great victory against the Jarls of the Vik, forcing them to accept baptism or face destruction. His fleet now controlled the sea roads between Jutland and the Orkneys, and his influence spread like fire through dry grass across the scattered settlements of the northern peoples. More significantly, the traders brought word that the Irish monasteries had been warned of coming raids and were moving their treasures inland to fortified strongholds that would require siegecraft and large numbers of warriors to overcome. The easy pickings that had sustained the northern raiders for generations were disappearing as their victims learned to adapt and defend themselves more effectively. This changes everything, Olaf argued in the family council that convened to discuss the season's plans. The old ways of raiding will bring us nothing but empty halls and broken ships. We must look to new strategies, new alliances, new ways of gaining wealth and honor. King Olaf's offer grows more attractive with each passing day. Eric's response came swift and sharp as his sword from its sheath. You speak like a merchant calculating profit rather than a warrior seeking glory. If the Irish have learned to hide their gold, then we will teach them that no wall can stand against northern determination. Other halls may send tribute to foreign kings, but the blood axe name will never be spoken in the same breath as submission. Pride without wisdom is the path to destruction, Olaf countered, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge gained during his fosterage at foreign courts. The world grows smaller with each passing year as trade routes expand and kingdoms form alliances across the Whale Road. We can be part of that larger world, or we can remain isolated in our fjord while others claim the prizes we think belong to us by right. Jarl Bjorn listened to his son's arguments with the patience of age and the growing awareness that his own time of decision-making was drawing to a close. The grey in his beard had spread like winter frost in recent years, and the old wound in his sword arm ached more deeply with each change of weather. He had hoped to see his sons united in purpose before the Norns called his thread to its ending, but the Völva's prophecy seemed determined to fulfill itself regardless of his desires. Both paths carry dangers, he said at last, his voice heavy with the weight of leadership's burden. To follow King Olaf is to abandon the ways of our fathers and accept the dominion of foreign gods. To continue the old pattern of raiding is to risk everything on increasingly desperate ventures as our enemies grow stronger and more prepared. Perhaps the time has come to divide our efforts, to let each son follow the path that calls to his heart, while maintaining the bonds of kinship that have always been our greatest strength. And the solution he proposed would have satisfied a merchant or a diplomat, but it rang hollow in the ears of warriors raised on tales of heroic simplicity and clear choices between honor and shame. Eirik's lip curled with barely concealed disdain at his father's attempt at compromise, while Olaf's expression showed his understanding that such divisions would inevitably lead to conflict, as each brother sought to prove the superiority of his chosen path. Division breeds weakness, Eirik declared, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, as if the weapon itself gave weight to his words. A hall divided against itself cannot stand against its enemies, and a warband that follows two leaders follows none. If my brother wishes to sail east to King Olaf's court, then let him go with my blessing and such followers as choose to accompany him. But I will not pretend that serving foreign masters brings honor to the Bloodaxe name. Olaf's response came quietly, but with the force of deep conviction behind it. I seek no foreign masters, brother mine. I seek alliance with those who possess the vision to see beyond the next raid or the next feast. King Olaf offers partnership, not servitude, to those strong enough to claim it. But perhaps you are right that our paths must diverge. Perhaps the Völva spoke truly when she said that one would sail beyond the sunset while the other sought Valhalla's golden hall. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying with them the scent of endings and the taste of decisions that could not be unmade. In that moment, both brothers understood that they stood at the crossroads of fate, where a single choice would determine not only their own destinies, but the future of all who bore the blood axe name. As the spring advanced towards summer and the sailing season approached, the division within the hall became too obvious to ignore. Warriors sharpened their weapons and checked their battle gear, but their preparations took different forms as they aligned themselves with one brother or the other. Eric's followers readied themselves for the traditional Viking expedition, while Olaf's men prepared for the longer journey to King Olaf's court and the uncertain future that awaited them there. The night before the ships were to sail brought a feast that would be remembered as the last time the Blood Axe Hall knew anything approaching unity. Jarl Bjorn ordered the sacrifice of a great ox to Thor, asking the god's blessing on both expeditions despite their different destinations. The blood was sprinkled upon the ship's prows and the warriors' weapons, binding them all to the same divine protection, regardless of the human divisions that separated them. Skald Thorolf composed a great song for the occasion, weaving together the threads of past glory and future hope in verses that would be repeated wherever northern men gathered to remember the deeds of heroes. His voice rose and fell like the sea itself as he sang of ships that sailed beyond the edge of the world and warriors who challenged the gods themselves in their quest for immortal fame. Hear now the tale of the Wolf brothers, born of one womb but destined for different skies, he sang, his harp strings echoing the rhythm of oars cutting water. One sails east to serve the Christ King, one west to wake the Irish gold. Both seek honor by different paths, both claim the blood of heroes past. The ravens watch and the Norns weave, and only time will tell which choice brings glory everlasting. When the formal verses were done and the mead had loosened tongues throughout the hall, the brothers found themselves face to face one final time as kinsmen rather than rivals. The firelight flickered across their features, highlighting the similarities that marked them as sons of the same father, while casting shadows that emphasized the differences that had grown between them, like a chasm carved by years of flowing water. "I wish you fair winds and good fortune," Eirik said, extending his hand in the gesture of warriors parting with respect intact despite their disagreements. "May Thor guard your ship and guide your sword to victory." Olaf clasped his brother's arm and felt the strength there that had made Eirik a byword for prowess in battle. "And may Odin's ravens carry news of your deeds to the farthest corners of the world," he replied. "Though we sail in different directions, we remain sons of the same hall and heirs to the same legacy of honor." Yet even as the words of formal courtesy passed between them, both brothers felt the cold touch of Weird upon their hearts. The Völva's prophecy whispered in the wind that sighed through the hall's rafters, and the ravens that perched upon the roof tree seemed to mock their attempt at reconciliation with cries that sounded like laughter from beyond the grave. The dawn brought wind from the south, and clear skies that promised good sailing for those bold enough to trust their lives to the Whale Road's mercy. 2 ships lay ready at the harbor's edge, their dragon heads gleaming with fresh paint and their hulls tight-corked against the sea's hungry embrace. Bloodhawk and Wavestrider had carried the Blood Axe warriors to victory in a dozen successful raids, and now they would bear the divided household toward whatever fate the Norns had prepared. Eric's crew of 40 warriors gathered around Bloodhawk with the easy confidence of men who had sailed together through storm and battle. Their weapons were sharp, their provisions carefully chosen for the long voyage to Hibernia's shores, and their hearts light with anticipation of the glory that awaited them. The ship herself seemed to strain against her mooring lines like a hunting hound scenting prey, her carved prow pointing westward toward the lands where Irish gold lay waiting for northern courage to claim it. Olaf's smaller band of 25 men made their preparations with equal care, but less obvious enthusiasm. They sailed not toward certain riches, but toward an uncertain reception at a foreign court, carrying with them the hope of alliance and the risk of disappointment. Wavestrider was the smaller and older of the two ships, but her captain knew her moods and capabilities better than any man alive, and his crew had learned to read wind and wave with the skill that comes only from years of careful observation. Jarl Bjorn stood upon the stone quay and watched his sons make their final preparations, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this parting might well be permanent. The Völva's words echoed in his memory like the tolling of a funeral bell, and he found himself wondering whether he looked upon his sons for the last time as living men, rather than memories preserved in saga and song. "The wind favors both departures," he said when the time came for formal farewells. "May it carry you to honor and bring you safe home when your ventures are complete." He clasped each son in the embrace of kinship, feeling the strength in their young bodies and the tension that still crackled between them like lightning waiting to strike. "Remember that you are brothers before you are rivals, and that the blood you share is older than any disagreement that divides you." Thora stood among the women gathered to bid farewell to the departing warriors, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed in public view. She had embraced both brothers in private and whispered her own prayers for their safety, but her heart told her that the Völva's prophecy was already beginning its inexorable fulfillment. The thread of her family's fate stretched taut as a bowstring, and she could only wait to see where the arrow would find its mark. "Remember me to King Olaf when you reach his court," she called to her younger brother as Wavestrider's crew prepared to cast off their lines. "Tell him that the Bloodaxe women still know how to weave strong cloth and brew good ale, and that his friendship with our house will always find a welcome at our hearth." "I will carry your words to the king's own ears," Olaf promised, his voice carrying clearly across the water as his ship began to move away from the quay. "And when I return with news of the wider world, perhaps you will have tales of your own to share." Eric's departure followed with considerably more ceremony as Bloodhawk's larger crew went through the rituals that preceded any major voyage. The ship's priest-navigator sacrificed a white cockerel to ensure favorable winds, sprinkling its blood upon the steering oar and the bronze weather vane that would guide them across the trackless waters. The warriors raised their shields in salute to those remaining behind, and their voices joined in the ancient sailing song that had carried their fathers across the Whale Road since the days when the world was younger and the gods walked openly among mortal men. As both ships disappeared beyond the horizon, one bearing east toward the rising sun, and the other west toward lands yet unexplored, those who remained behind settled into the routines of summer in a diminished haul. The fishing boats still went out with the dawn, the flocks still grazed the hillside pastures, and the business of survival continued as it had for countless generations. But everyone felt the absence of the departed warriors, like a missing tooth that the tongue cannot help but probe. The Völva Astrid emerged from her sacred grove more frequently in the days that followed, her ancient eyes scanning the southern horizon as if she could see beyond the curve of the world to where the brothers sailed toward their separate destinies. Her pronouncements grew darker and more specific as the summer progressed, filled with images of blood on bronze and ravens feasting on the eyes of the proud. "I see ships burning on distant waters," she told those who came seeking her wisdom. "I see brothers' hands red with forbidden blood, and I hear the wolves of hell howling for prey that wears familiar faces. The Norns have begun their cutting, and the pattern grows clear to those with eyes to see." Jarl Bjorn listened to these prophecies with the stoic acceptance of a man who had learned that fate could neither be avoided nor hastened by mortal action. He continued to rule his diminished household with the same steady hand that had guided it through decades of prosperity, but those close to him could see the weight that pressed upon his shoulders like a physical burden. The grey in his beard seemed to spread with each passing day, and the lines around his eyes deepened like furrows ploughed by the passage of too many seasons. Meanwhile, far to the east, Olaf's ship Wavestrider rode the swells of the Skagerrak as her crew navigated by star and sun toward the court of King Olaf Tryggvason. The voyage had been blessed with favorable winds and calm seas, allowing the small ship to make good time, despite her heavy cargo of gifts and trade goods intended to smooth their reception at the royal court. Olaf stood in the stern beside his steersman, his eyes fixed upon the distant coast of Noreg, where his foster-age lord waited to receive him. The young warrior had spent the long days of sailing in deep contemplation of the choice he had made and its likely consequences. To embrace the White Christ in truth, rather than mere political expedience, would mean abandoning the gods of his fathers, turning his back on the traditions that had shaped his people since the dawn of memory. Yet he could not deny the evidence of his own eyes, which had shown him how the Christian kingdoms grew in wealth and power, while the old ways led only to increasing isolation and diminishing returns. "Do you think we sail toward wisdom or folly?" he asked his closest companion, a grizzled warrior named Thorstein, who had served his father for 20 years before choosing to follow the younger son into uncertainty. "I think we sail toward change," Thorstein replied, his weathered hands steady on the steering oar as he felt the ship's response to wind and current. Whether that change brings wisdom or folly depends upon how well we adapt to what we find. The world shifts like the sea beneath us, and those who refuse to shift with it find themselves drowning in deep water. As they spoke, the lookout in the bow called out that he could see the smoke of cooking fires rising from the royal settlement of Nidaros. King Olaf's hall dominated the harbour like a testament to the new order that was spreading across the northern lands, its cross-topped spire rising higher than the traditional dragon head that had once crowned such buildings. Ships from a dozen kingdoms lay at anchor in the protected waters, their crews engaged in the business of trade and diplomacy that had replaced the simple raiding patterns of earlier generations. The reception they received proved that King Olaf's invitation had been sincere rather than merely polite. The king himself came down to the harbour to greet his former foster son, embracing Olaf warmly before leading him and his men to quarters within the royal compound. That night's feast featured entertainment by skalds, who sang not of ancient gods and heroes, but of the new saints and martyrs whose stories were replacing the older tales in the halls of converted kings. "You come at an auspicious time," King Olaf told his guest as they sat together at the high table. "My campaign against the heathen jarls proceeds better than I had dared hope, and I have need of proven warriors who understand both the old ways and the new. Your reputation from the Irish raids precedes you, and your knowledge of your father's coastal strongholds could prove invaluable in the seasons to come." The words were spoken with warmth and apparent friendship, but Olaf heard the subtle implication beneath their surface: courtesy. The king sought not merely his service, but his betrayal of family loyalties, information that could be used against his own father's hall if circumstances demanded it. The price of royal favor might well be paid in the coin of kinship betrayed, a thought that chilled him more deeply than any winter storm. "My loyalty to you is complete, Lord King," he replied carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man walking across thin ice. "But the bonds of blood and fosterage that connect me to my father's house are sacred things that cannot be lightly broken. I would serve your cause gladly, but I would not purchase advancement through the betrayal of those who shaped me." King Olaf's smile remained fixed, but something cold flickered in his eyes like sunlight on steel. "Loyalty is indeed a virtue," he agreed, his voice carrying undertones that suggested the conversation was not finished despite his guest's diplomatic response. But there are loyalties that conflict with one another, and wise men know how to choose between competing claims upon their honor. We will speak more of these matters when you have had time to consider the opportunities that service in my court might provide. Far to the west, Eric's expedition faced challenges of a different sort as Bloodhawk's crew made landfall on the coast of Hibernia after a voyage marked by contrary winds and ominous portents. The ravens that had followed them across the Whale Road seemed more numerous than usual, and the ship's priest-navigator reported dreams filled with dark imagery that suggested the gods' favor was not certain for this enterprise. The Irish coast that greeted them showed clear signs of the changes that traders had reported throughout the spring. Watchtowers rose from strategic headlands, their smoke signals carrying warning of the northern ships' approach to settlements, hidden inland beyond easy reach of seaborne raiders. The monasteries that had once offered easy pickings now stood empty or heavily fortified. Their treasures moved to strongholds that would require siegecraft and large numbers of warriors to overcome. "The sheep have learned to bite," observed Gunner Ironside, Eric's second in command and a veteran of a dozen successful raids. "This will not be the simple wolf work we expected when we planned this venture back in the spring." Eric studied the hostile shore through eyes that had inherited his father's keen understanding of tactical situations. The easy raids that had filled their grandfather's ships with gold and slaves were clearly a thing of the past, replaced by a new reality that demanded different strategies and greater risks. Yet retreat was unthinkable for a young warrior seeking to establish his reputation as a leader worthy of following. "Then we will teach them that teeth are useless against true wolves," he declared, his voice carrying across the ship to reach every member of his crew. "We came here for Irish gold, and we will not return to our haul empty-handed because the prey has learned to hide. There are inland settlements that have never seen dragon ships, and their wealth waits for men bold enough to seek it beyond the comfortable reach of the Whale Road." The plan he outlined required abandoning the ship and striking inland on foot, a dangerous proposition that meant giving up their surest route of escape if the enterprise went badly. Yet his crew had followed him this far across the sea, and their loyalty held firm even as they contemplated the risks of the venture he proposed. They were northern wolves in truth, and the scent of distant gold was stronger in their nostrils than the prudent voice of caution. They dragged Bloodhawk onto a concealed beach and covered her with branches and turf against discovery by Irish patrols, leaving a guard of 10 men to ensure their escape route remained secure. The remaining 30 warriors set out into the green hills of Hibernia with weapons sharp and hearts high, following ancient tracks that led toward the rich monastery of Glendalough, where pilgrims had gathered for generations to honor their white Christ in stone buildings filled with precious things. The march took them through countryside that seemed to mock their northern origins with its lush abundance. Even in late summer, the grass grew thick and green, watered by frequent rains that would have been counted a curse in their own harsh lands. Cattle grazed in peaceful herds, fat and sleek under the gentle sun, while fields of grain stretched golden toward horizons, unmarked by the stone and ice that defined the world they knew. "This is a land that breeds soft men," Eirik observed, as they paused to rest beside a clear stream that ran between banks lined with flowers. "No wonder the Irish flee when they see our ships upon their horizon. They have forgotten what it means to struggle for survival, grown weak on the abundance their gentle climate provides." But Gunner Ironside, whose years of raiding had taught him to read the signs that others missed, noticed things that troubled his warrior's instincts. The countryside was too empty for the richness it displayed, the cattle too few for the quality of the pasture. Smoke rose from hidden settlements that vanished like morning mist when the raiders approached, and the tracks they followed showed signs of recent use by large numbers of armed men. "I mislike the quietness of this place," he confided to his young leader as they made camp in a grove that offered concealment from unfriendly eyes. In my experience, when the prey is too easy to find, it often means that hunters have become the hunted without realizing their change of fortune. His words proved prophetic when the dawn brought not the expected march toward Glendalough, but the war cries of Irish warriors emerging from concealment on all sides of their temporary camp. The trap had been laid with cunning worthy of northern strategists, using the raiders' own assumptions about Irish weakness against them with devastating effectiveness. Horns rang from the hilltops as the net closed, and Eirik found himself facing odds that would have challenged even his father's legendary war band at the height of their power. The battle that followed became the stuff of saga in both Irish and northern halls, a clash that demonstrated the courage of warriors bred in different traditions, but united in their willingness to die well when death became inevitable. Eirik's men formed the shield wall that had served their people for countless generations, their overlapping shields creating a hedge of steel that no enemy could easily breach. Behind this barrier, their spears thrust and their axes fell with the precision that came from years of training in the art of group combat. The Irish attacked with the fierce valor of men defending their homeland against foreign invaders, their long spears seeking gaps in the northern defense while their slingers sent stone missiles whistling through the morning air. They had learned much from previous encounters with Viking raids, adopting tactics that neutralized many of the advantages that had made the sea wolves so feared in earlier generations. For a time that seemed to stretch like the space between the lightning and the thunder, the outcome remained balanced on the knife's edge of chance and courage. Warriors fell on both sides, their blood darkening the green grass as the ravens began to gather overhead in anticipation of the feast to come. Eirik fought like a man possessed by the battle fury of his ancestors, his sword, Adda's kiss, drinking deep from Irish veins, while his voice rose in the war songs that called upon Thor and Odin to witness his valor. But numbers and preparation told in the end, as they always did when courage was equal on both sides. The Irish pressed their attack with the patience of hunters who knew their prey was trapped, wearing down the northern shield wall through sheer persistence rather than desperate charges. One by one, Eirik's warriors fell to spear thrust and sword stroke, their shields growing heavy and hands weakened by loss of blood and the exhaustion that comes from prolonged combat. When the sun stood at its zenith, only a handful of northerners remained standing in a circle that grew smaller with each passing moment. Eirik himself bore wounds that would have felled a lesser man, his byrnie torn and his sword arm slick with his own blood. Yet he continued to fight with the desperate fury of a wolf brought to bay, knowing that death was certain, but determined to make his ending worthy of the skald's songs. "Come then, Irish dogs," he roared, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield despite the weakness that threatened to buckle his knees. "Come and learn what it costs to cross blades with the sons of wolves. I go to feast in Valhalla's golden hall, and I will save seats at the high table for any who dare join me there." The final charge came with the inexorability of the tide, overwhelming the last defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Eirik died as he had lived, with sword in hand and defiance on his lips, his young life ending in the manner that every northern warrior secretly hoped for when he first took up weapons in his lord's service. The ravens that had followed him across the Whale Road from his father's hall settled upon his still form, their dark eyes reflecting the afternoon sun as they prepared to carry news of his passing to the Allfather's throne. Gunnar Ironside, who had fallen at his leader's side with his own weapon buried deep in an Irish chest, used his last breath to speak the ritual words that would ensure Eirik's story would be remembered. "Here lies Eirik Bjornsson, called Bloodaxe after his father's line, who sailed west to seek Irish gold and found Valhalla's gate instead. Let the skalds sing of his courage, and let the ravens carry word of his glory to the halls of gods and men." The Irish warriors, who had won the victory at such terrible cost, treated their fallen enemies with the respect due to brave men who had died well. They gathered the northern dead and built a great pyre upon the hillside, sending their souls to whatever gods awaited them with honor intact despite their defeat. The weapons of the fallen were offered as trophies to the monastery they had come to plunder, while their leader's sword was sent to the High King in Tara as proof that the northern threat could be met and overcome. Word of the disaster reached Bloodaxe Hall with the autumn storms, carried by one of the 10 men who had been left to guard the ship. He had waited through the agreed-upon time for his companion's return, then sailed back across the Whale Road with the bitter news that would shatter the peace of the fjord like a stone cast into still water. His arrival during the harvest feast turned celebration into mourning as Jarl Bjorn received confirmation that the Völva's prophecy had begun its terrible fulfillment. The young wolf sought glory and found death instead, the survivor reported, his voice hollow with the weight of failure and survival when better men had died. He fell fighting like a hero of the elder days, his sword red with enemy blood and his name on the lips of the ravens. But the Irish were ready for us, Lord, prepared with numbers and cunning that turned our strength against us. The easy days of raiding are finished, and those who would seek gold across the Whale Road must find new ways or face the fate that took your son. The news struck Jarl Bjorn like a physical blow, aging him visibly as he absorbed the reality of his heir's death. Eric had been more than a son to him. He had been the embodiment of everything the Bloodaxe line had stood for through generations of warriors. His death meant not only personal loss, but the potential end of the family's legacy, for Olaf remained far away at a foreign court where his loyalties grew more doubtful with each passing season. Thora wept for her brother with the abandon of genuine grief, her tears falling like spring rain upon the ancient stones of the hall's foundation. Yet even in her sorrow, she recognized the truth of the Völva's words and the inevitability of what was to come. Eric's death had removed half of the prophesied conflict, but the other half remained to be fulfilled in ways she could only begin to imagine. Now there is only Olaf, she said to her foster-age sister as they prepared her brother's empty burial mound, raising stones in memory of a warrior whose body lay far from the land of his birth. The Völva spoke of brothers turned to enemies, but how can there be enmity between the living and the dead? What threads do the Norns yet weave from this tragedy? The answer came with the winter storms, carried by messengers who had ridden hard through the season of ice and darkness to bring word from King Olaf's court. The news they bore would transform grief into bitter anger and set in motion the final acts of the drama that the Völva had foreseen in her vision of backward-flying ravens. Olaf had not merely accepted service in the Christian king's war band, he had embraced the foreign faith with the fervor of a true convert, allowing himself to be baptized in the cold waters of the Nidelva, while his new lord stood as sponsor and witness. More troubling still, he had accepted a mission that would bring him into direct conflict with the traditions of his father's house, leading a force of Christian warriors against the heathen Jarls who still honored Thor and Odin in their sacrificial groves. "Your son spreads the word of the White Christ with fire and sword," the messenger reported, his words falling into the shocked silence of the hall like stones into a deep well. "He has sworn an oath to King Olaf that no heathen temple will stand unconquered in the lands that acknowledge Christian rule. Already he has burned 3 sacred groves and forced their priests to flee or face death. The people whisper that he has become something other than the man who sailed east in the spring." Jarl Bjorn listened to this recitation with the growing horror of a man who sees his worst fears taking solid form before his eyes. The son who had survived the division of his household had become something far worse than dead. He had become Nidingur, a man without honor who had broken faith with gods and ancestors alike. The shame of such apostasy cut deeper than any sword wound, poisoning the very air of the hall with its presence. "He is no longer my son," the Jarl declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall where his household had gathered to hear the messenger's words. "Let no man speak the name of Olaf Bjornsson beneath this roof, for he has chosen foreign gods over the faith of his fathers and foreign gold over the honor of his blood. He is Nidinger and faithless, and his name is dirt in my mouth." The formal curse that followed was terrible to hear, for it severed the bonds of kinship with a finality that no mortal power could reverse. Jarl Bjorn raised his hand toward the carved images of the gods that watched over his high seat and spoke words that would echo through the halls of memory long after his own death had claimed him. "By Thor's hammer and Odin's spear, by the sacred fire that burns eternal in this hall, I cast out the one who was my son and declare him outlaw to our line. Let the ravens pick his bones and let no grave give him rest. Let his name be forgotten by the skalds and his deeds be counted as nothing in the reckoning of honor. He is dead to me and mine, and we are dead to him from this day forward." The curse fell upon the hall like a physical weight, pressing down upon the assembled household with the force of divine judgment. Women wept openly at the formal severing of family bonds, while the warriors sat in grim silence as they contemplated the implications of what they had witnessed. A house divided against itself could not long endure, and the blood axe line seemed destined to end in betrayal and bitter recrimination. Thora felt the curse's weight more heavily than any other, for she alone remained to carry the family's blood into whatever future awaited them. The Völva's prophecy had indeed spoken truly of brothers turned to enemies, though the enmity had taken a form more terrible than simple rivalry for inheritance. One brother lay dead in foreign soil, while the other lived as an enemy to everything their father's hall represented. "The wheel turns as the Norns decree," she whispered to the winter wind that howled around the hall's walls like the voices of the dishonored dead. But still it turns, and what seems like ending may yet prove to be beginning in disguise. Her words proved more prophetic than she knew, for the spring brought visitors whose arrival would set in motion the final threads of the Völva's weaving. 3 ships appeared on the horizon with the first Thor, their dragon heads gleaming with fresh paint, and their crews singing the war songs of men intent upon serious business. They flew the banner of King Harald Bluetooth of the Danes, and their leader bore credentials that commanded respect, even from those who owed no allegiance to Danish rule. Jarl Erik Bloodaxe of Orkney was a distant kinsman of Bjorn's line, his own family having split from the main branch 3 generations past, when his grandfather had carved out holdings in the island kingdom that lay between the Danish realm and the unconquered lands of Scotland. He was a man in his middle years, grey-bearded and scarred by decades of warfare, but his reputation as a leader and strategist had spread throughout the northern world like the fame of legendary heroes. "I come in friendship to a hall that has known great loss," he announced as his ship's crew made their vessel fast to the stone quay. "The news of young Eric's death has reached even the Orkneys, and his courage in facing overwhelming odds is already becoming the stuff of saga. I would offer my condolences to his father and my service to a house that has always been counted among the most honorable in the northern lands." The formal courtesies masked deeper purposes, as Jarl Bjorn understood from his first glimpse of the visitors' well-armed crews and the calculating intelligence in their leader's eyes. Erik Bloodaxe had not sailed across dangerous waters merely to offer sympathy for another man's loss. He came seeking alliance or advantage, perhaps both, in the complex game of politics that determined the rise and fall of jarls throughout the northern world. "You are welcome in my hall," Bjorn replied, extending the hospitality that custom demanded regardless of his private suspicions. "Though the times are dark and the future uncertain, the bonds of kinship and the ties of shared blood still command respect between honorable men." The feast that followed gave both men the opportunity to take each other's measure while maintaining the fiction of casual social interaction. Eric Bloodaxe proved to be an entertaining guest, regaling the hall with tales of his campaigns against the Pictish kings and his expeditions into the unexplored regions where ice and mist guarded secrets older than human memory. Yet beneath his courtesy lay the hardness of a man who had built his power through careful calculation and ruthless action when circumstances demanded it. "These are changing times for all who follow the old ways," he observed, as the evening wore toward its close and the mead had loosened tongues throughout the hall. "The Christian kings grow stronger with each passing season, and they show little tolerance for those who honor Thor and Odin in the ancient manner. Soon, we may find ourselves choosing between conversion and extinction, unless we can unite against the common threat that seeks to destroy everything our ancestors built." The implication was clear enough to those who understood the language of diplomacy and alliance-making. Eric Bloodaxe sought to build a confederation of heathen jarls who would stand together against the spreading influence of Christian kingdoms, and he needed the Bloodaxe name and reputation to give weight to his cause. The death of young Eric had created an opportunity for outside influence in a hall that had previously been too strong to need foreign alliances. "Unity has its place," Jarl Bjorn agreed carefully, his words chosen with the precision of a man walking through a field of hidden pitfalls. "But the price of alliance must not be the surrender of independence that has always marked the Bloodaxe line. I would hear more of your thoughts on these matters before committing my hall to any course that might compromise the honor of my ancestors." The negotiations that followed stretched through the remaining days of Eric's visit, touching upon matters of mutual defense, shared raiding ventures, and the complex web of marriage alliances that bound the great houses together across the Whale Road. Gradually, a picture emerged of a confederation that would unite the remaining heathen strongholds under Eric's leadership, pooling their resources and knowledge to resist the encroachment of Christian influence. The proposal was attractive in many ways, offering the promise of renewed purpose and the strength that came from unity in the face of common enemies. Yet it also carried the implicit acknowledgement that the age of independent jarls was ending, that survival in the changing world required the surrender of some portion of the autonomy that had always defined northern leadership. As the discussions continued, Thora found herself paying close attention to the subtle currents of negotiation and alliance building that flowed beneath the surface of formal courtesy. Her position as the Jarl's only remaining heir gave her a unique perspective on the choices facing her father's hall, and she began to understand that her own future was as much at stake as the political independence of the Bloodaxe line. "Eric Bloodaxe seeks a marriage alliance," she confided to her fosterage sister as they worked at their looms in the women's quarters. "He has a son of marriageable age, and the union of our lines would cement the political bonds he seeks to forge. Father has not yet given his answer, but I can see him weighing the advantages against the cost of such an alliance." Ingrid's shuttle paused in its passage through the warp threads as she considered her friend's words. "Would such a marriage displease you greatly?" she asked, with the careful neutrality of one who understood that great matters often hinged upon small personal decisions. "The reputation of the Orkney Bloodaxe line is honorable, and alliance through marriage has always been the way of noble houses." "I do not fear marriage to an honorable man," Thora replied, her hands steady despite the uncertainty that clouded her thoughts. "But I fear the loss of my father's independence more than I fear any husband. If we become vassals to Eric's confederation, then the Bloodaxe name becomes merely one voice among many, rather than the proud standard it has always been." Her fears proved well-founded when the formal proposal came during Eric's final night in the hall. The Orkney Jarl spoke with the eloquence of a man accustomed to winning others to his cause, painting a picture of mutual prosperity and shared strength that would benefit both houses equally. His son Magnus was a proven warrior of 23 winters, he explained, a young man who had already distinguished himself in battles against Scottish raiders and Irish pirates. The union of our houses would create a bond stronger than bronze, Eric declared, his voice carrying clearly through the hall where the household had gathered to witness the negotiation. Magnus has need of a bride worthy of his station, and your daughter has earned a reputation for wisdom and courage that would grace any man's hearth. Together, their children would inherit the strength of both lineages and the friendship of all who honor the old ways. Jarl Bjorn's response came slowly, weighted with the consideration due to a proposal that would shape the future of his line for generations to come. He looked upon his daughter where she sat among the women, seeing in her face the same strength and intelligence that had marked her mother and grandmother before her. The choice he made would determine not only her personal fate, but the direction his hall would take in the uncertain years ahead. "The offer brings honor to my house," he said at last, his words formal but carrying undertones that suggested deep reservations about the alliance being proposed. "But such matters cannot be decided hastily, for they touch upon obligations that extend beyond the lives of those who make them. I would have time to consider all aspects of what you propose and to consult with those whose counsel I value in weighty matters." Eric Bloodaxe accepted this diplomatic delay with good grace, understanding that hasty decisions often led to unsatisfactory results in affairs of such importance. "Wisdom lies in careful consideration," he agreed, his manner suggesting complete confidence that time would work in his favor. "I will await your answer until the autumn thing, when all the great Jarls gather to settle the year's disputes and plan the ventures to come. Perhaps by then the shape of the future will be clearer to all who must navigate its currents." The departure of the Orkney ships left Bloodaxe Hall quiet and subdued, as if the very walls themselves were contemplating the weight of the decision that hung over them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Jarl Bjorn spent long hours in solitary thought, walking the familiar paths of his domain, while he weighed the advantages and dangers of the alliance that had been offered to him. The summer that followed brought more news from the wider world, carried by traders and travelers who made their way along the established routes that connected the scattered settlements of the northern peoples. The reports they brought painted a picture of accelerating change as Christian kingdoms consolidated their power and traditional rulers found themselves increasingly isolated from the currents of political influence. King Olaf Tryggvason's campaigns had achieved remarkable success, with one heathen stronghold after another falling to his combination of military pressure and religious persuasion. The Jarls who had once ruled as independent lords now served as his subordinates, their authority derived from royal favor rather than ancestral right. Most troubling of all, these reports confirmed that Olaf Bjornsson had become one of the most effective agents of this transformation, his intimate knowledge of heathen customs and traditions making him invaluable in the work of conversion and conquest. "Your lost son leads the vanguard of the king's army," a trader reported during one of the regular market days that brought visitors to the hall's vicinity. "They say he knows the location of every sacred grove and heathen temple within 100 miles of the royal court, and he shows no mercy to those who resist the new faith. The people call him the White Wolf, for he hunts his own kind in service to foreign masters." The name struck Jarl Bjorn like a physical blow, for it carried implications that went beyond simple religious conversion. A wolf that hunted its own pack was an abomination in nature, a creature that had abandoned its proper place in the order of things. The title suggested that his son had become something fundamentally alien to the traditions that had shaped him, a weapon turned against the very people who had given him life and purpose. As the summer drew toward its close and the time of the autumn thing approached, The pressure to make a decision about Eric Bloodaxe's proposal grew stronger with each passing day. The Völva Astrid emerged from her sacred grove with increasing frequency, her pronouncements taking on an urgency that suggested the threads of fate we were approaching another crucial juncture in their weaving. I see ships with strange sails bearing down upon familiar shores, she told those who sought her counsel during the late summer sacrifice to Freya. I see the White Wolf leading a pack of foreign hounds to bay before the doors of his father's hall. The wheel of vengeance turns, and those who have sown the wind prepare to reap the whirlwind of their choices. Her words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled rather than mere prediction, and they cast a shadow over the preparations for the autumn thing that no amount of practical activity could dispel. Jarl Bjorn found himself torn between the immediate need for allies and the long-term cost of surrendering his independence to Eric Bloodaxe's confederation. The decision that had seemed straightforward in the abstract became agonizingly complex when viewed against the backdrop of approaching crisis. Thora watched her father's struggle with the clear-eyed understanding of one who had learned to read the subtle signs of political calculation and personal doubt. Her own fate hung in the balance of his choice, yet she found herself more concerned with the survival of their hall's independence than with the personal implications of marriage to a stranger from distant islands. "If the Völva speaks truly of approaching danger," she said during one of their private conversations in the days before the Thing assembly, "then perhaps the time for careful consideration has passed. A hall that stands alone may preserve its independence only to find itself overwhelmed by enemies too numerous to resist." Her father's response came slowly, weighted with the accumulated burden of leadership and the growing awareness that his own time of decision-making was drawing to its close. "Independence without the strength to maintain it is merely stubborn pride wearing the mask of honor," he agreed, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. "Yet alliance purchased at the cost of everything we have stood for is no better than surrender dressed in diplomatic language." The solution that gradually emerged from their discussions would have satisfied neither extreme position, but it offered a path forward that preserved some measure of honor while acknowledging the realities of their strategic situation. Rather than accepting Eric Bloodaxe's proposal in its entirety, Jarl Bjorn would negotiate terms that maintained his hall's autonomy while committing to mutual defense against common enemies. The marriage alliance would be deferred, pending proof that such cooperation could work without compromising the essential independence of either party. The autumn thing convened under grey skies that seemed to mirror the uncertainty clouding the future of all who gathered beneath its temporary pavilions. Representatives from dozens of halls and kingdoms had made the journey to the traditional meeting ground, their banners and heraldic devices creating a colorful display that masked the serious nature of the business to be conducted. Legal disputes would be settled, trading agreements negotiated, and alliances forged or broken according to the ancient customs that had governed such assemblies since the dawn of recorded memory. Eric Bloodaxe received Jarl Bjorn's counter-proposal with the careful neutrality of an experienced negotiator who had anticipated some modification of his original terms. The discussions that followed stretched through several days of formal sessions and private meetings, touching upon every aspect of the proposed confederation and its implications for the participating halls. "You drive a hard bargain," Eric observed during one of their final private conferences, his tone suggesting grudging respect for his kinsman's negotiating skill. "But perhaps that is for the best, as alliances forged too easily often prove too weak to survive the first test of their strength. We will try your way first, and let experience teach us whether closer bonds become necessary in the future." The agreement they reached satisfied no one completely, but offered advantages to all parties that outweighed its obvious limitations. The participating halls would maintain their independence in internal affairs while coordinating their responses to external threats through a council of equals rather than the hierarchical structure Eric had originally envisioned. Marriage alliances would be encouraged, but not mandated, allowing personal choice to play a role in decisions that affected the future of entire lineages. Yet, even as the formal ceremonies sealed their agreement with oaths sworn on sacred arm rings and weapons blessed by the assembled priests, all parties understood that larger forces were already in motion that might render their careful negotiations meaningless. The Christian kingdoms showed no inclination to respect treaties made by heathen rulers, and the pressure for conversion or conquest continued to mount with each passing season. The winter that followed brought the heaviest snows anyone could remember, as if the gods themselves sought to isolate the northern settlements from the changes sweeping across the world beyond their frozen borders. Bloodaxe Hall settled into the familiar rhythms of the cold season, with long evenings spent around the great fire, listening to skaldic recitations and planning the ventures that would mark the coming year. But the isolation that winter traditionally provided proved illusory, for the snow-blocked passes could not prevent the flow of information that connected every significant settlement through networks of kinship and obligation. Reports continued to arrive of King Olaf Tryggvason's expanding influence and the role that the apostate Olaf Bjornsson played in extending Christian control over territories that had once acknowledged no authority beyond their own traditional leaders. "The White Wolf strikes again," reported a messenger who had struggled through the drifts to bring news from the eastern settlements. 3 more heathen temples have fallen to his torches, and their priests have fled rather than face the choice between conversion and death. The king rewards him richly for each success, they say, and speaks of him as the most valuable of his servants in the work of bringing the true faith to the benighted Northlands. Each such report struck Jarl Bjorn like a fresh wound, reopening the grief and anger that his son's apostasy had inflicted upon his heart. The formal curse he had pronounced remained in effect, but it could not erase the memories of the boy he had raised or the hope he had once placed in Olaf's potential for leadership. The knowledge that his son had become an active enemy of everything the Bloodaxe line represented was more bitter than any physical defeat could have been. As the winter slowly gave way to spring and the promise of resumed contact with the outside world, the Völva Astrid's pronouncements took on an increasingly urgent tone that suggested crucial events were approaching with the inevitability of the changing seasons. Her emergence from the sacred grove became more frequent, and her words carried the weight of visions that showed her scenes of conflict and resolution drawing near. "The White Wolf prepares for his greatest hunt," she announced during the spring sacrifice to Thor, her voice carrying clearly across the assembly of worshippers who had gathered to mark the return of the sailing season. "He comes with foreign blessing and familiar knowledge, leading hounds that bark in a foreign tongue but follow scents that are known to them from childhood. The reckoning that was prophesied draws near, and those who would survive it must choose their loyalties before the choice is taken from them." Her words proved prophetic in ways that exceeded even her own far-seeing vision, for the first ships of the season brought not traders or friendly visitors, but scouts from King Olaf Tryggvason's fleet, their presence marking the beginning of the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the Bloodaxe line and all who had bound their fortunes to its success or failure. The advance guard consisted of 2 ships bearing the royal banner and crewed by warriors whose equipment and discipline marked them as elite troops rather than ordinary raiders. Their leader carried credentials that demanded respect even from those who owed no allegiance to his king, and his mission was stated with the diplomatic clarity that often preceded military action. King Olaf sends greetings to Jarl Bjorn Bloodaxe and expresses his hope that wisdom will prevail in the discussions to come, the emissary announced as his ships made their formal approach to the harbour. His Majesty desires nothing more than the peaceful conversion of all his subjects to the true faith, and he offers generous terms to those who choose the path of cooperation rather than resistance. The terms offered were indeed generous by the standards of conquest and forced conversion, allowing Jarl Bjorn to retain his title and authority in exchange for accepting baptism and agreeing to support the king's religious policies throughout his domain. The heathen temples would be destroyed and their treasures turned over to the crown, but no other punishment would be imposed upon those who submitted willingly to the new order. Yet beneath the diplomatic language lay an unmistakable threat, for the emissary made it clear that refusal would be met with the full force of the royal army. King Olaf had grown tired of negotiating with stubborn heathen lords, and his patience with those who resisted his authority had reached its limits. The choice offered was submission or destruction, with no middle ground available for those who sought to preserve their independence through compromise. I require time to consider proposals that would change the very foundation of my hall's existence, Jarl Bjorn replied, his words carefully chosen to avoid either immediate acceptance or outright defiance. Such matters touch upon obligations to gods and ancestors that cannot be lightly set aside, and wisdom counsels careful thought before irreversible decisions are made. The emissary accepted this request for delay with the patience of a man confident in his ultimate success, understanding that time favored the king's cause more than it served the interests of potential resistors. His Majesty is prepared to grant reasonable consideration, he agreed, his manner suggesting complete confidence in the eventual outcome. But the season advances, and other pressing matters require the king's attention. I will return in 1 month's time to receive your final answer. The departure of the Royal Scouts left Bloodaxe Hall buzzing with urgent discussion as the household faced the most crucial decision in its long history. To submit meant abandoning the faith of their fathers and accepting subordination to a foreign king whose authority derived from sources they had never acknowledged. To resist meant facing overwhelming odds in a conflict that could result in the total destruction of everything they had built over generations of careful effort. Jarl Bjorn called upon his allies in Eric Bloodaxe's confederation, sending swift messengers to carry word of the ultimatum and request immediate consultation on the response to be made. Yet even as the riders departed on their urgent missions, he understood that the time for careful alliance building and diplomatic maneuvering had passed. The crisis demanded immediate action, and the luxury of extended deliberation was no longer available. The council that convened included representatives from all the major halls that had committed themselves to mutual defense against Christian expansion, their varied banners and heraldic devices creating a display of unity that masked deep divisions over the best course of action. Some advocated immediate submission, arguing that resistance would only bring destruction without achieving any meaningful purpose. Others called for defiant resistance regardless of the odds, maintaining that honor demanded a glorious death over a shameful surrender. Eric Bloodaxe himself argued for a middle course that acknowledged the military realities while preserving some measure of dignity and independence. "We cannot match the king's numbers in direct battle," he pointed out with the blunt honesty that had built his reputation as a strategic thinker. "But we can make conquest so costly that he may prefer negotiation to the destruction of potential subjects. A fighting withdrawal that preserves our core strength while demonstrating our resolve may win better terms than either immediate submission or futile last stands." The debate that followed touched upon every aspect of their strategic situation, from the loyalty of their own followers to the possibility of external support from kingdoms beyond the reach of King Olaf's influence. Gradually, consensus emerged around a plan that would test the king's resolve while preserving options for future negotiation if resistance proved futile. They would refuse the initial demand for submission, but offer to negotiate specific terms that might satisfy the king's religious objectives without requiring complete capitulation. The confederated halls would coordinate their resistance, making it clear that an attack on one would bring retaliation from all, while seeking to drag out the confrontation long enough for circumstances to change in their favor. Yet even as the plans took shape, all participants understood that they were grasping at straws in a windstorm, hoping that courage and cunning could somehow overcome the harsh mathematics of military superiority. The king commanded not only greater numbers, but better equipment, superior logistics, and the crucial advantage of fighting for a cause that attracted support from powerful allies throughout the Christian world. The month of grace period passed with agonizing slowness as preparations for the expected conflict consumed every waking hour in Bloodaxe Hall and its allied settlements. Weapons were sharpened, defenses strengthened, and alliances confirmed through the exchange of hostages and the swearing of binding oaths on sacred arm rings. The entire fabric of daily life was subordinated to the overriding necessity of preparing for a struggle that would determine whether their ancient way of life would survive into the future. When the royal emissary returned as promised, he brought with him a fleet of 15 ships bearing the cream of King Olaf's military forces. The sight of so many dragon heads riding at anchor in what had once been their peaceful harbor drove home the reality of their situation more effectively than any diplomatic ultimatum could have done. The age of independent jarls was ending, and those who would not yield to the new order faced extinction as surely as winter followed autumn. The final negotiations were brief and unsatisfactory to all parties, as the gulf between the positions proved too wide for any meaningful compromise. King Olaf's representative reiterated the original terms without modification, while Jarl Bjorn's counter-proposals were dismissed as attempts to avoid the fundamental choice between submission and resistance. "Your king demands the surrender of everything that has given meaning to my ancestors' lives," Bjorn declared, when it became clear that no middle ground existed. "He asks me to betray the gods who have protected my hall and abandon the customs that have shaped my people since the dawn of memory. Such prices are too high for any earthly advantage, regardless of the consequences that may follow refusal." The emissary's response carried the finality of divine judgment rather than human negotiation. "Then you have chosen the path of destruction over the road to salvation. King Olaf will grieve for the necessity that drives him to use force against his own subjects, but he will not allow stubborn pride to prevent the spread of the true faith throughout his rightful domains." As the royal ships prepared to depart, their commander made one final gesture that struck at the heart of the defenders' resolve more cruelly than any military threat could have done. A small boat approached the harbor under a flag of truce, bearing a single passenger whose familiar features sent shockwaves throughout the watching crowd. Olaf Bjornsson stepped onto the stone quay, wearing the white robes of a Christian priest beneath a byrnie of foreign make, his sword replaced by a cross of worked silver that caught the afternoon light like captured fire. His face bore the marks of the years that had passed since his departure from his father's hall, but his eyes held the fervor of absolute conviction that marked him as a true believer in his adopted faith. "I come in the name of the Christ who died for the salvation of all men," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the water to reach the ears of those who had once called him brother and son. "I offer one final chance for peace and redemption to those who have not yet closed their hearts to the truth that could save them from the darkness of their heathen errors." The confrontation between father and apostate son that followed would be remembered and retold as long as the northern peoples preserved their traditions of oral history, a scene that captured the essence of an entire civilization's struggle to maintain its identity in the face of overwhelming pressure for change. Jarl Bjorn stood upon the harbor's edge like a figure carved from stone, his weathered features showing no emotion as he looked upon the young man who had once been the hope of his bloodline. "I see before me a Nidinga wearing the face of my dead son," he said, his words falling into the silence like stones cast into deep water. "You have chosen foreign gods over the blood of your fathers and foreign gold over the honor of your name. There is nothing more to be said between us, for the living cannot speak with the dead except through the offices of völvas and cider workers." Olaf's response carried the passionate conviction of a man who had found meaning in surrender to a cause greater than personal ambition or family loyalty. "I have found life eternal in the service of the one true God," he declared, his voice rising to carry his words to every ear within the sound of his voice. "The darkness that blinded me has been lifted, and I see clearly the path that leads to salvation for all who have the courage to follow it. Father, I beg you to set aside the pride that dooms you and accept the mercy that is offered freely to all who repent of their errors. The only mercy I seek is a clean death with sword in hand," Jarl Bjorn replied, his hand moving to rest upon the pommel of his ancient blade. "Keep your promises of foreign heaven for those weak enough to believe them. I will feast in Valhalla with my fathers, or share the dishonor of those who break faith with their ancestors." The theological and personal argument that followed laid bare the fundamental incompatibility between the old ways and the new, between a worldview that honored strength and courage above all else and one that preached submission to divine authority as the highest virtue. Father and son stood on opposite sides of a chasm that no amount of eloquence or emotional appeal could bridge, their positions hardened by years of conviction and commitment to irreconcilable principles. When words proved insufficient to achieve conversion through persuasion, Olaf made one final attempt to prevent the bloodshed that his own actions had made inevitable. Drawing his silver cross from beneath his byrnie, he held it high in the gesture of blessing that his new faith had taught him to use as a weapon against the forces of darkness. "In the name of Christ Jesus, I call upon the demons that possess this place to release their hold upon the souls of my kinsmen," he intoned, his voice taking on the ceremonial cadence that marked formal religious ritual. "Let the light of truth dispel the shadows of heathen error, and let those who dwell in darkness come forth into the salvation that awaits all who renounce their former sins." The reaction of the assembled household to this attempted exorcism was swift and violent, as warriors reached for weapons and women called upon their own gods for protection against the foreign magic being worked in their midst. Only Jarl Bjorn's raised hand prevented immediate bloodshed, his authority still strong enough to restrain his followers despite the provocation they had witnessed. "Begone from this place," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of paternal authority, even as it pronounced final separation. "Take your foreign god and your alien blessings back to those who welcome such things, but know that when you return with sword and fire, you come as enemy and not as son, and you will receive the welcome that enemies deserve from northern warriors." Olaf's departure marked the end of any possibility for peaceful resolution, as both sides understood that the confrontation to come would be decided by strength of arms rather than eloquence of argument. The ships that bore him away carried with them the last hope for compromise, leaving behind only the grim certainty of battle and the knowledge that the ancient way of life they defended was making its final stand against the tide of change. The siege that followed became legendary throughout the northern world, a struggle that pitted the declining strength of the old gods against the rising power of the White Christ, and his earthly representatives. King Olaf's army established camps on the heights surrounding Bloodaxe Hall, cutting off all routes of escape, while positioning siege engines that could reduce the strongest walls to rubble through patient bombardment. Yet the defenders possessed advantages that numbers alone could not overcome, for they fought on ground that their ancestors had chosen and fortified over generations of careful planning. The hall's position on its rocky headland made direct assault nearly impossible, while hidden passages and secret water sources allowed them to endure siege conditions that would have broken less prepared strongholds. For 6 months, the siege continued, marked by episodic battles that demonstrated the courage of both attackers and defenders, while gradually wearing down the resources and resolve of all involved. The Confederated Halls sent what aid they could through the tightening net of royal forces, but their own defensive needs prevented them from committing enough strength to break the siege through external pressure. Within Bloodaxe Hall, the long months of isolation took their toll on both morale and supplies, as the household faced the slow erosion of hope that marked any prolonged defensive action. Yet the defenders maintained their cohesion through the power of shared conviction and the leadership of those who understood that surrender meant not just personal defeat, but the extinction of everything their culture had achieved. Thora emerged as an unexpected source of strength during the darkest periods, her clear vision and practical wisdom providing guidance that complemented her father's military leadership. She organized the women's work of maintaining weapons and caring for the wounded, while her knowledge of the hall's hidden resources helped stretch their supplies beyond what conventional planning would have achieved. "We may not survive this trial," she told the assembled household during one of the council meetings that marked each phase of the siege, "but we can ensure that our enemies pay such a price for victory that others will think twice before challenging halls that honor the old ways. Let the skalds sing of our courage, and let the ravens carry word of our defiance to the very halls of the gods." Her words proved prophetic when the final assault came with the spring thaw, as King Olaf's forces launched a coordinated attack that exploited every weakness in the defenders' position while demonstrating the tactical skill that had made the royal army legendary throughout the northern world. The battle that followed raged for 3 days and nights, as determined defenders met disciplined attackers in combat that would be remembered as long as men told tales of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. Jarl Bjorn fell on the second day, his ancient sword finally shattered by the press of enemies, as he defended the great hall's entrance with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. His death cry echoed across the battlefield like the howl of a dying wolf, calling upon Thor and Odin to witness his final act of defiance against the foreign god whose servants had destroyed his world. "Here dies Bjorn Bloodaxe," he gasped with his last breath, his hand still gripping the broken hilt of his father's blade. "Remember to the skalds that he chose honor over life and death over dishonor. Let his name be spoken with respect in the halls of gods and men." The fall of their leader might have broken the defenders' resistance, but Thora's voice rose above the clamor of battle to rally the survivors for one last stand. Taking up her father's broken blade, she stood in the doorway of the hall where her ancestors had feasted for 5 generations, her young voice carrying the authority of one who had accepted the burden of leadership in its darkest hour. "We are the last of the Bloodaxe line," she cried, her words reaching every corner of the great hall where the remaining defenders had gathered for their final battle. "Let us die as our fathers lived, with weapons in our hands and courage in our hearts. The halls of Valhalla wait for those who fall with honor intact." The end came with the setting sun on the 3rd day, as the royal forces finally breached the hall's defenses and poured into the building that had sheltered 5 generations of northern warriors. Thora died fighting beside the eternal hearth that had burned since her great-grandfather's time, her woman's blade red with enemy blood, as she kept faith with the traditions that had shaped her people since the dawn of memory. Yet even in death, the Völva's prophecy continued its inexorable fulfillment, for among the Christian forces that stormed the hall was Olaf Bjornsson, his white robe stained with the blood of combat as he led his converted warriors in the final assault. The sight of his sister's body beside their father's corpse struck him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the human cost of the religious crusade that had consumed his life. "I sought to save them," he whispered to the smoke-filled air, where the spirits of the dead seemed to linger like morning mist. "I offered them life eternal in exchange for their submission to the truth." Why could they not see that their gods were powerless to protect them? The answer came not from any mortal voice, but from the Völva Astrid, who had emerged from her sacred grove to walk among the corpses that littered the hall's floor. The ancient woman moved through the carnage like a figure from another world, her milk-white eyes reflecting scenes that existed beyond the reach of ordinary vision. "They saw clearly enough," she told the apostate son as he knelt beside his sister's still form. "They saw that some things are worth more than life itself, and that honor preserved is victory of a sort that your foreign god cannot understand. You have won the battle and lost your soul, White Wolf, and the price of that exchange will follow you to whatever grave claims your bones." Her words proved more prophetic than even she knew, for Olaf's triumph turned to ashes in his mouth as he looked upon the destruction his choices had wrought. The conversion of Bloodaxe Hall brought King Olaf no strategic advantage, for the defenders had destroyed everything of value rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The victory was complete but hollow, purchased at a cost that exceeded any reasonable estimate of its worth. In the days that followed, as the royal forces prepared to move on to other targets in their campaign of conversion and conquest, Olaf found himself haunted by memories of the childhood he had shared with his sister and the father he had betrayed. The silver cross at his throat felt heavy as iron, and the white robes that marked his priestly status seemed to mock his pretensions to spiritual authority. The Völva's final prophecy came as he stood beside the smoking ruins of the hall where he had learned the warrior's craft and heard his first skaldic songs. Her ancient voice cut through the morning mist like a blade forged from truth itself, carrying words that would echo in his memory until the day of his own death. "You sail now toward lands beyond the sunset," she told him, her far-seeing eyes fixed upon horizons that existed in times yet to come. "The ravens that flew backward in my first vision have found their meaning in the wheels turning, and the sons of this hall will indeed see shores where no Völva's sight has wandered. But the price of that destiny is the blood you have spilled this day, and the thread of your weird leads through darkness before it finds the light." Her words proved prophetic in ways that would not become clear for years to come, as Olaf's guilt over the destruction of his family drove him to seek redemption through ever more dangerous ventures in service to his adopted faith. When King Olaf Tryggvason organized the great expedition to carry Christianity to the unconverted lands beyond the Western Sea, the White Wolf volunteered to lead the advance guard, hoping that distance and new challenges might quiet the voices of the dead that haunted his dreams. The ships that sailed from Noreg in the final year of the 10th century carried the surviving warriors of a dozen conquered halls, men who had accepted conversion rather than face destruction, but who remained northern wolves at heart despite their new allegiance. Among them sailed Olaf Bjornsson, bearing the silver cross of his priestly office, but dreaming of the sister he had failed to save and the father he had helped to destroy. The voyage that followed took them beyond the settled lands of Iceland and Greenland, following currents and wind patterns that led toward shores where no European foot had ever trod. The expedition established settlements in the land they called Vinland, building halls that blended Christian symbols with architectural traditions inherited from their heathen ancestors. Yet even in the new world that lay beyond the edge of the old, the threads of Weird continued their patient weaving, as Olaf's attempts to escape his past only led him deeper into the labyrinth of consequence and regret. The native peoples they encountered proved no more willing to accept foreign gods than his own family had been, and the pattern of conversion through conquest repeated itself with variations that made each new conflict a fresh reminder of the choices that had shaped his life. The end came for Olaf Bjornsson in a forest clearing beside a river that flowed toward seas unnamed by any Skald's tongue, his body pierced by arrows fletched with eagle feathers, and his silver cross trampled into earth that had never known the tread of Christian feet. In his final moments, he saw not the paradise his adopted faith had promised, but the faces of his sister and father as they had appeared in his last sight of them, standing together in the doorway of their burning hall, with weapons raised in defiant salute to gods who had not abandoned them despite their defeat. The ravens that settled upon his corpse carried news of his death back across the Whale Road to the lands of his birth, where the Volva Astrid nodded with satisfaction as her ancient prophecy reached its completion. The backward-flying ravens of her vision had indeed found their meaning in the wheels turning, and the saga of the Bloodaxe line had ended as she had foreseen in the grove, where 9 thralls had once hung as offerings to the All-Father. Yet endings in the northern tradition are also beginnings, for the blood of heroes does not die with the bodies that carried it through a single generation of strife and glory. In the ruins of Bloodaxe Hall, where grass now grew through the stones that had once supported the high seat of Jarl, children played among the fallen timbers and told each other stories of the brave ancestors who had chosen death over dishonor in the twilight of the ancient ways. The Volva's final vision before her own death showed her ships with dragon heads sailing into sunsets yet to come, bearing the children of those children toward destinies that would be shaped by the choices their ancestors had made in the dark days when the old gods yielded to the new. The thread of their word stretched forward through time like a golden cord, connecting past sacrifice to future glory in the endless pattern that the Norns wove upon their loom of fate. The saga ended as it had begun, with ravens circling against the sky and prophecy fulfilled in ways that exceeded mortal understanding. The Bloodaxe name had passed into legend, but the spirit that had animated it lived on in the hearts of all who heard the tale and understood that some things remained worth dying for, regardless of the cost that such convictions might exact. In halls throughout the northern world, skalds sang of Bjorn Bloodaxe and his children, weaving their story into the great tapestry of heroic memory that preserved the deeds of the worthy long after their bones had returned to the earth. Their voices rose like smoke from the eternal hearthfires, carrying the names of the honored dead to the ears of gods and men alike, ensuring that courage once displayed would never be forgotten, while the northern peoples remembered how to honor those who chose glory over safety and legend over life. The wheel of fate continued its turning, and new heroes rose to take their places in the endless saga of those who dared to challenge the boundaries of the possible. But the memory of the Bloodaxe line remained as a beacon for all who came after, a reminder that even in the darkest times, when ancient ways gave ground to foreign innovation and traditional loyalties fractured under the pressure of change, there would always be those willing to pay any price rather than surrender the values that gave their lives meaning. The ravens flew on toward whatever future awaited them, their harsh cries echoing across the Whale Road as they carried news of human courage and divine justice to shores yet undiscovered. Behind them, the past lay buried beneath the accumulating years like autumn leaves beneath winter snow. But the seeds of future glory remained alive in the hearts of all who understood that the greatest victory was not survival, but the preservation of honor in the face of overwhelming odds. Thus ended the saga of the Blood Axe line, in blood and fire, and the promise of stories yet to be told. The Volva's prophecy had fulfilled itself as inexorably as the passage of the seasons. But from its ashes rose the eternal truth that courage displayed becomes courage remembered, and courage remembered becomes courage renewed in the hearts of those who hear the tale and choose to follow in the footsteps of heroes, whatever the cost may prove to be.